Okay, everyone. So I wanted to go over a little lab in AnyQ 303 this week, really on just some basics of digital SLR. We've just started talking about this idea of digital SLR cameras. We discussed the exposure triangle, aperture, ISO, shutter speed. They're a little bit of foreign terms still. And then we also discussed what an exposure is, whether a picture is correctly exposed, underexposed, overexposed, and kind of the idea of that. And so my hope today was to, again, give you a little bit of an introduction into a digital SLR camera. I've got one of those sitting right here for you. We'll talk a lot more about specific digital SLR bodies and lenses a little bit later, but again, I talked to you about the differences between maybe some film as well as this digital SLR. I want to show you whether you have one or not, kind of some basics in terms of care, changing out lenses, things to keep in mind, and I kind of just our intro lab at the beginning of the semester. And so I figured I'd start off today. We'll come back to this digital SLR right here, but I figured I'd start off today talking a little bit about where we came from and where we are now. And so this is an old school, this happens to be a Canon, but this is an old school film camera. And so, you know, the thing about this that you have to keep in mind as compared to where we are today with doing things that we can in the digital era is if you look at the back of this is where your film went. We have a sensor basically on the back of our digital SLR now. Before, you had a roll of film, much like this, and that roll of film would come out and then go over across, and then as we opened up that shutter, based on our aperture, our image was exposed onto this film media, okay? And so things have become so much easier now in a world of digital, where you don't have that, okay? This was a roll of film that I found still laying around from back in the day of shooting film. We used to use this Ilford film. The thing to remember about this as compared to what I was talking to you guys about in class with digital cameras is this was an ISO 400 film, if you can see right there, okay? And so that was dictated by the film that you chose, okay? And so the other two aspects of the exposure triangle, you can control aperture and shutter speed, but this had to stay static with your ISO. In this digital age now, you guys are able to change aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and so it makes it much more productive in being able to change those settings. And so that's one of those things I just wanted to point out with the old film cameras. When it used to come down to developing those, again, this was one of our old school mechanisms that we would use to develop film, and we would literally take it and roll it onto these spools, okay? And it was tough. You know, you might take good pictures and great pictures, but you could mess it up easily in the developing process, okay? And so we would roll film onto these carriers right here, and the film goes evenly spaced all the way around, but if it didn't go on properly and two areas of the film were touching, it wouldn't expose, okay? And so there was a lot to it when it came to getting your film correctly exposed. It wasn't just the fact that I took pictures. Now you get this instant feedback, and for you to learn in the beginning, like I told you guys, it is so much easier because one, you get the instant feedback, but two, there's really no cost to learn other than having a digital camera and a digital SLR, okay? Once you have that, you can go out and shoot for hours. Go back, critique your photos, see what you like, what you don't like, improve upon. Again, you have to be your harshest critic, and then delete them all and go out and do it again if you want, okay? It doesn't cost you a thing beyond that initial overhead. And so I also brought out one of these old school point and shoot cameras. We were talking about these the other day, and some differences between this and that digital SLR. Again, you can see as I turn this on, lens pops out. We can go ahead and take a picture here. But when we do that, the one thing to remember is that everything is in focus in the background. You saw the flash fire. The camera doesn't know. It's just trying to get a correct exposure. Many times I don't like to use a flash. I can adjust the ISO accordingly so that it doesn't need to be done, okay? This doesn't have that necessary capability because it doesn't know what your subject is. Everything's in focus, very middle of the road aperture. Shutter speed kind of middle of the road too, If you run past, especially in a low light scenario, it's not going to capture you in an instant. It's not going to freeze frame. Most of the time, it's going to end up pretty blurry. And so there's a lot of limitations with this old school point and shoot. But again, we don't see these used too much. I'm not putting people going out and buying point and shoot cameras with the advent of cell phone cameras, okay? And the cell phone cameras are much better than this. This was a 7.1 megapixel camera. Your cell phone does way better than this these days. And so most people either fall into this line of taking photos with cell phone or moving up to more professional photos with that digital SLR. Another thing that I wanted to show you guys that's a little bit different, but still really cool. We've had this kind of reinvigoration of some old school stuff that's come back, much like records, and that is the old Polaroid camera, okay? And so it's worth discussing. I used to show these to the class in the past and have them go out and take some pictures with a Polaroid because there's not a whole lot you can adjust. You can't change the shutter speed, you can't change the aperture. You have to go back to just your old school framing a picture and making sure that you like the composition and what's in the frame. And so it takes a lot of those elements away of being able to adjust things and just frame that photo. But these are cool in terms of technology. Now this is a new one that you can actually go out and buy. I should have brought one down that is the old one. It looks pretty similar, but it's about 30 years older. And with this, you still have, I'll open it up just to show you the inside. So this is where the film media in the cartridge goes. You can close that up. And then once you turn this thing on, all you have to do is then basically go over and frame your subject over here, pull the shutter button right here, and then you'll see a film media that then turns out, and it comes out looking like this. Takes a little while to expose, and immediately you have a film exposure on this. Okay, you got to keep it out of the light. Usually, put it in your pocket or somewhere else away, and then you'll get an exposure on this media. I just spit this one out of it a minute ago just to be able to show you guys, so there's nothing on it. But it's immediately developed onto that photographic medium. And so Polaroids were a very cool technology with that. Whether you buy one that's 30 years old or whether you buy one today, you can still get the film media for them, and I think that's pretty cool. This one's empty now. We could actually pull out this cartridge and show you. And so this is what that looks like. You've got usually about 6 exposures, not very many, that sit within this little cartridge, okay? No batteries are generally needed in the old ones that was enveloped inside this cartridge. That's changed a little bit with the newer ones, so all they have in them is film, okay? And so pretty cool to be able to see. And so we've talked a little bit about the old school film cameras, that point and shoot, those Polaroids that have come back. Now let's focus a little bit on the digital SLR camera, which is really the highlight of this course, okay? And there's some things, whether we're using the cameras in course or not, that I want you guys just generally to be familiar with. And you go out and you buy a digital SLR, you're using one. And so this is just a lens hood that's sitting on the front. Helps with some sun flare, anything else that might be kind of contributing to a glare on the lens if it's really sunny outside. And so if you're not using this, a lot of times it can be turned back around on the lens just like this, but most of the time that's in the way if you're trying to do something. And so we'll take that off altogether right now and just show you a few things. And so this is a couple things. So this is a 24 to 70 millimeter lens that we have on right now, okay? Now, not all 24 to 70 millimeter lenses look the same. This happens to be a full frame body. We'll talk about what that means here in a little bit. But when you go and you take maybe a telephoto lens, so this is a old school telephoto lens that we see right here. We can take our lens hood off. This one essentially goes 80 to 400 millimeters. And so just realizing that that's a gauge for the type of lens that it is, and we'll talk more about those lenses and bodies. But again, 400 millimeters is much more zoom to it as compared to something that is 24 or 14. 14 millimeters can be really wide angle. And again, we'll talk about that in much more detail. And so coming back to this that we see here, a couple things that I want you guys to be familiar with just in kind of a general overview of the camera, and then we're going to talk about each part of that exposure triangle in more detail in class here next week. But one thing to note, especially with these cameras, right here you have a lens release button, okay? And so all you have to do is push that in, and then from there rotate your lens, and then keeping it all steady, you can pull the two pieces apart, okay? Now, the one thing about this is I don't ever want you to pull the lens and the camera body apart just like this in a really dusty environment, okay? We want to make sure that if we're doing that, it is in some environment that's very clean. So I've got the two pieces right here, and so we can put this back on top of our lens, we can put this on top of our camera body, and if we weren't going to put anything back, we could leave those two just like so, okay? If we wanted to switch lenses, and we're just going to do that in an easy approach, one thing that I will frequently do, and so let's put these back the way that they were. So when you're putting this on, you'll see on these Nikons, there is a white dot, okay? There is a white dot on that camera body. The two white dots align, so put it on there carefully, and then turn up, snaps into place, and your lens is locked on. Again, we're not going to do this in a dusty environment. We want to keep the inside of that camera body and the inside of this lens extremely clean. Dust on there is going to be a problem. It's also going to show up on your photos. And so push down this lens release button, rotate, put it up. If I'm switching to this lens, all I'm going to do is take this, swap it over to that one, take this, white dots, line them up, turn it on, they're good to go. You've got a new lens on this digital SLR body, okay? And so pretty easy to change back and forth, but I want it to be a quick motion. Don't walk around your apartment or outdoors or anywhere else with the lens off and the camera body wide open. If you're not going to put a lens back on, make sure you put one of these covers on it in its place, okay? So that's one of the first things I wanted to show you. When it comes time to, again, use a digital SLR camera, if it's one that you buy or one that maybe I have out at the Equine Center, on all of them, we're going to talk about filters themselves a little bit later, but just to tell you in the beginning, on all of them, there is a UV filter, okay? And so if you looked at this right here, you'd see it says little 77 millimeter UV protector, okay? And I could show you just by spinning it. And so we take this off, and you guys can see right through it. It's just a clear UV filter, and honestly, that is serving more for protective purposes of this lens than anything else, okay? And so if you drop this, something else happens, and you scratch the UV filter, not a big deal. I can take it off, throw it away, buy a new one. You scratch the lens, that's a much bigger issue. This is about a $2,000 lens right here, okay? And so it's not something that you want to scratch. And so we keep those UV filters on. If you're using the cameras at the Equine Center and the UV filter is dirty, you can clean the outside of it. I always keep a lens cleaning cloth around. You can take this before you go to shoot photos and just wipe off that lens. If there is dust or dirt or anything between this UV filter and the lens itself, please let me know. I'm happy to take them apart and clean them. If you do it, you got to be very careful that, again, you don't scratch that lens. Everything's perfectly clean before you put it back together, okay? But everything I use is going to have a UV filter on it. This one does, anything that you might come across, okay? And so I highly recommend that on your digital SLR lenses, okay? Especially as you start to invest in more expensive equipment. Now, let's look inside this for just a moment and talk about some other characteristics in cleaning. And so we can take this and we'll put this back on here. And so inside you can see, I just wanted to show you the difference from the film era and the film days, okay? You can see inside here, inside this digital SLR body, a little bit of maybe a reflective medium in there. This is where that sensor's at, okay? And so that's the difference between this and our old school film camera. There's no film. Basically, it's being developed onto this sensor, okay? And so we're going to put this back on momentarily. This is something, again, I like to keep really clean, so don't walk around with this wide open. If you do have issues over time, there are lens cleaning kits. Now is kind of the best time to show you that in this course. And so these little bulb, you get a puff of air, and it's got a little brush on it as well. And so we got to be very careful if we're trying to get dust out on the inside of something, whether we can blow it off. We can flip the mirror up for cleaning inside these. SLR stands for single lens reflex camera. All of your digital SLRs are going to be a mirror inside them. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more with a mirror up function later. You can go to Best Buy or look online more these days and find what they're calling mirrorless cameras. Sony is a big one that has out a lot of mirrorless cameras that are similar to digital SLRs, but they're not a true digital SLR because, again, they're a mirrorless camera. A few other little lens cleaning cloths and wipes that you see in a kit like this. Some little Q-tips. That, again, if you need to get a little piece of dust off or debris, something that's in the way, sometimes they stick on there pretty well. Again, make sure you use this. Do not take your finger and stick your finger inside this camera body and try to clean it around and remove that dirt, okay? And so that's just a little bit of some background on etiquette when it comes to changing the lens out. That can be daunting sometimes, making sure you're in a good environment when you do so. I'm not going to do it inside Picket Arena. If it's super dusty, I might go up in the grandstands, turn around, go to the bathroom, whatever else that might be, to be able to change that appropriately, okay? Now, let me throw a lens back on here just for the sake of a little bit more discussion. And so if we do this, pop this off. Okay, and so when we do this, these are all autofocus lenses now. And so on these lenses, there's actually a lot of terminals, okay? And you can see all these little sensors right here, okay? That aids us in autofocus and a lot of other technology on these lenses, okay? So we've got 2 rings on this. Again, this is just general basics with SLR camera to make sure we're all on the same page. 2 rings on this. One ring is zoom, okay? And so this is a zoom lens we'll talk more about, zooming from 24 to 70 millimeters. And the next ring is a focus ring, okay? This can be done if it's in manual focus. Otherwise, if I turn this on and I click down halfway on the shutter, you're going to hear and basically that is the autofocus taking place, okay? And so with this, if we all of a sudden take off this, we basically look through here, okay? And so very easily we can go through, and you heard a little zzz, and it's tough to hear, but it is focusing, okay? And so I can basically put this on whatever I want, push the shutter halfway. When the shutter goes down halfway, the shutter button, it will focus, lock on. I can put a little rectangle through this viewfinder on the horse's head, the horse's eye. It'll be in focus, okay? And so I personally move that focus point around, and we'll talk about that in much more detail a little bit later, okay? Other things in terms of etiquette, always hold these lenses. These lenses get heavy. The way to properly hold this digital SLR camera and lens is underneath the lens, just like this, okay? Don't hold them just simply like this, okay? This can be a very heavy lens. When you look to some of these long telephoto lenses, I could have pulled out another bigger one. This gets really heavy, okay? And that's why if they have a tripod mount, they have their own individual leg, because the tripod should go on here to best balance the camera body rather than going on the bottom right here if you're using a big lens. But irregardless whether it's that telephoto or this one, proper etiquette would be to hold it on the bottom of the lens just like so, okay? And then you can rotate your zoom, and you can put your eye through the viewfinder, and you can push halfway, focus, push all the way, and it takes a picture, okay? And so again, might sound like some basics, but I just want to make sure that, again, those can be some things that are commonly overlooked. And so how to change the lens, how to hold it properly, adjust zoom. We don't need the focus ring because we have it in autofocus. Other than that, that's kind of some of the general basics. Most of these digital SLR bodies that I really like, and even the D7100s that we use in class, have 2 dials on them, okay? They've got a dial on the back right here that you could see, okay? And they've got a dial on the front right here that you could see. I really do like this if you're out shopping around for camera. Again, we're going to talk about camera bodies a little bit more, but this allows us to then roll that back dial and change the shutter speed, roll that front dial and change our aperture, and then I can simply hold down a button and roll the back dial again and change our ISO. And so all 3 elements of the exposure triangle can be easily adjusted. ISO takes an additional button because it's not something we're changing as frequently. Aperture and shutter speed, I can very easily roll between those front and the back dials, okay? And so some of your more consumer line cameras don't have that adjustment. I really do like this display on the top right here. Become very used to that. That shows us all of our settings. Shows us if we're in manual, aperture priority, shutter priority. It's also going to, when I push the shutter button down halfway like it is right now, show us f4. F4 will be our aperture, shows us 40, so 1/40th of a second is our shutter speed, and then shows us 800 is our ISO. And so very easily I can look at that and tell all three elements of my exposure triangle, and that is extremely important. As we continue through our discussion, you have to know what those are for the photographs that you are taking, okay? And so with that, that's kind of your initial rundown of the digital SLR camera. There's still a lot of buttons that we will continue to go over. If you have specific questions, I encourage you to reach out and ask, and I'm happy to answer them. But again, very easy to be able to do that. Now, with the digital SLR, I want you looking through the viewfinder right here, okay? I realize they have this big LCD screen on the back. It's not meant for you to put it in live view like we can do right here, and all of a sudden you can see that live view on the back, okay? It's not meant to take pictures holding off like this all the time. It is okay if you're doing video, that's acceptable, but not for pictures, okay? Uses up a lot of battery too. That back LCD is good for reviewing things, and so if you go take a picture right now, and we say we're going to take a picture here, and I want to look at that, I can very easily look at that on the back of the camera and view it and say it is underexposed, overexposed, adjust accordingly, and then take a new photo. It goes black shortly thereafter. If I want to hit play, I can review it again, okay? But otherwise, it is something that we're not going to constantly just look at that LCD, okay? So please do look through the viewfinder. If you do, just so you know, if you do wear glasses and you want to ideally remove those glasses, maybe so you can look through the viewfinder, there is always a, what they call a diopter. It's just right here, a little dial, okay? And you can adjust that so that the viewfinder is clear to you, okay? You want to make sure when you're looking at things that are in focus that you are truly viewing them in focus, okay? And so that's kind of our initial rundown. Hopefully you know now, again, always carry this lens cleaning cloth with me. We can take this, put our lens cap back on. Always start with the lens cap on when you're not using it. And then in this case, we can put our lens hood on. So if we're going to go out and shoot outside in the sun, this is how that lens hood goes on. If we're no longer using it, we can take this, spin it around for storage purposes, okay? But hopefully you're a little more familiar now with just the inner workings of a digital SLR camera. Showing you the film camera as well, maybe that point and shoot Polaroid. There's lots of other cool things out there. If I was to just show you, again, this would be another lens that is a 70-200. Again, another expensive lens. And I'll tell you why these are more expensive than some that might look smaller that have an even larger focal length range than this, okay? We'll talk more about lenses in specifics. And so with that, hopefully we start to get you guys excited about some photography stuff. And if you have questions, like I said, feel free to reach out and ask. We'll continue to talk about those three elements of the exposure triangle: aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. You will know all the details to them, and we'll start breaking those out more individually in some lab videos as well. And so with that, I'll talk to you guys soon.